Imagine boarding a flight with everything to lose, your dreams, your future, even your life, stored in one small pouch under your seat. Now imagine a single decision, a single act of prejudice, ripping that lifeline away at 35,000 feet. Tonight, we're diving into the story of Naomi Carter, a teenager whose flight to opportunity became a fight for survival. Naomi Carter had always been told she was destined for something extraordinary. At just 17, the bright-eyed teenager from Baltimore carried more weight on her shoulders than most people would face in a lifetime. She was the daughter of Dr. Marcus Carter, a respected pediatric immunologist, and Evelyn Carter, a woman whose quiet resilience had held the family together through years of hospital visits, experimental treatments, and nights filled with uncertainty. Naomi had fought long and hard against a rare autoimmune condition that threatened to clip her wings before she ever had the chance to fly. Today, however, she was flying, literally and figuratively. She boarded a Sendair Flight 732 with her parents, bound for San Francisco. The purpose of the trip wasn't leisure, it was destiny. Naomi had been granted a coveted interview at Stanford University, a chance at a scholarship that could reshape her future forever. For a girl who had once spent weeks in a hospital bed staring out the window at planes taking off, the irony was not lost on her. Now she was the passenger, and the world seemed to be opening its doors. But what the other passengers did not know, and what Naomi tried to hide beneath her smile, was that her life depended on a refrigerated pouch her father carried with obsessive care. Inside were her injectable medications, carefully stored at the right temperature, worth more than $18,000 but priceless to her survival. Without them, her body would begin to turn against itself in a matter of hours. Dr. Marcus Carter had done everything by the book. He carried TSA cards, medical clearance letters, prescription documentation, all meticulously checked and rechecked. He was a man who had spent his career protecting children, and now, more than anything, he was determined to protect his own daughter. He clutched the insulated pouch like a lifeline as they boarded, believing that this flight was simply the first step toward a brighter tomorrow. Naomi, meanwhile, sat by the window seat and opened her small leather-bound journal. She scribbled a line in neat, hopeful handwriting. This could be the day everything changes. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as passengers shuffled to their seats, unaware that this seemingly ordinary journey was about to become a national flashpoint. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. As the seatbelt sign blinked on, and the plane began its ascent, Naomi pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The sky was a soft gradient of blues and golds, clouds stretching like endless fields of cotton. For once, she felt normal, just another teenager on her way to college dreams. Her mother squeezed her hand, her father gave a reassuring nod, and for a fleeting moment, the Carters allowed themselves to exhale. What none of them realized was that at 35,000 feet, peace can be as fragile as glass. One wrong move, one misunderstanding, one act of prejudice could shatter it all. And before this flight touched the ground again, Naomi's future, her dignity, and even her life would hang in the balance. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow as a Sendair Flight 732 leveled off above the clouds. A sense of calm seemed to wash over the passengers. The rumble of takeoff had faded into a steady, reassuring hum, the kind of background noise that lulled children to sleep and gave adults permission to loosen their shoulders. For Naomi Carter, this was the rarest of feelings, normalcy. She leaned into her seat by the window, gazing out at the endless expanse of sky. The horizon stretched wide and golden, the sun painting the clouds in hues of rose and amber. For the first time in days, her breathing slowed into an easy rhythm. Her mother, Evelyn, pulled a blanket over her lap and smiled faintly, though her eyes remained watchful. Evelyn had mastered the art of quiet vigilance, never smothering, but never letting go entirely either. Years of managing Naomi's illness had trained her to measure joy in careful doses, like a mother spooning medicine. Just enough to heal, not so much that it could hurt. Naomi rested her hand lightly against the insulated pouch tucked beneath the seat. She didn't need to see it. She only needed to feel the reassurance of its presence. Inside, the carefully cooled vials of medication glistened like fragile glass soldiers, ready to defend her body from the invisible war it waged against itself. The pouch had traveled with her everywhere, a silent guardian that carried both hope and dread. Her father, Marcus, sat across the aisle, his posture precise even in rest. He looked at Naomi often, checking her color, the brightness in her eyes, the ease in her breath. Then he would glance at the pouch, almost reflexively, as if the simple act of watching it could ensure its safety. In his mind, he replayed the steps he had taken that morning, double-checking the doctor's letters, reviewing TSA's medical clearance guidelines, securing the prescriptions in multiple forms, and confirming that the cooling packs would last the duration of the flight. Marcus Carter was not a man who left things to chance, not when his daughter's life was on the line. Naomi, however, chose to focus on something brighter. She opened her leather journal again and scribbled another line beneath her earlier entry. The clouds look like fields you could run across. Maybe one day I'll be free enough to try. Her handwriting wobbled slightly with the turbulence, and she laughed quietly at herself. To anyone else, it was a small thing. But to her, it was freedom. Around them, the cabin was alive with its own quiet dramas. A Hispanic family tried to calm their restless toddler 2 rows ahead. An elderly Asian man politely asked for more water, and was met with a curt nod from the flight attendant. Businessmen scrolled on laptops, students leaned on travel pillows, and couples shared earbuds. Life in miniature, 35,000 feet above the ground. Naomi turned to her mother. "Do you think they'll like me?" she asked softly. Evelyn brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. "Honey, they'll love you. Not just for your grades or your essays, but because you have something most people never learn. You've already fought for your life, and you're still smiling." Naomi smiled back, but her eyes drifted toward the overhead lights, the sterile air, the steady hum. She knew too well how fragile this peace was. Every moment of calm felt like it carried a shadow, a reminder that life could tip in an instant. Still, she allowed herself to lean into the illusion. For a moment, she was just another teenager dreaming about college, not a girl whose survival depended on a pouch of medicine hidden at her feet. But as the cart wheels squeaked down the aisle, and the first sharp voice of flight attendant Karen Whitaker cut through the soft murmur of the cabin, that fragile peace began to tremble. The Carters did not yet know it, but the flight was about to descend into a storm far more dangerous than turbulence. The first warning sign came not from what was said, but from the tone in which it was delivered. Karen Whitaker had been working for Ascendair for nearly 2 decades. To the casual eye, she was simply another uniformed professional, moving crisply down the aisle with her service cart. But to those paying closer attention, her voice carried an edge sharper than it needed to be. "Ma'am, I said your bag has to go all the way under the seat." Her words snapped at a young Hispanic mother juggling a toddler on her lap. The woman flinched, muttered an apology, and bent awkwardly to push her diaper bag further in. Moments later, Karen stopped at the row of an elderly Asian man who had politely pressed his call button for a glass of water. She set it down with a stiff hand, avoiding eye contact, her lips pressed thin, as if even this small courtesy was an inconvenience. Most passengers did what people often do in such moments. They lowered their gaze, choosing silence over confrontation. But Naomi noticed. Her heart squeezed a little tighter. She had seen this before, on sidewalks, in classrooms, in waiting rooms where people like her were spoken to just a little differently. Karen moved methodically, but when her eyes fell on the Carters' row, her posture stiffened. Naomi had discreetly pulled out the small insulated pouch, her fingers trembling slightly as she prepared to take her scheduled dose of medication. The pouch was unremarkable to most, a plain gray case with a medical alert tag clipped to the zipper. But in Karen's eyes, it seemed to morph into something far more sinister. "What's that?" Karen's voice cut through the air, sharp and accusing. Naomi froze. Her mother instinctively reached for her hand. Marcus, ever calm, looked up and spoke evenly. "It's prescribed medication," he said, keeping his tone measured. He reached into his pocket, and produced a neatly folded letter. Here's the doctor's note, along with the TSA clearance documentation. But Karen didn't look at the letter. She stared at the pouch as if it were a ticking bomb. I'll need to inspect that. Her voice was firm, unyielding. Naomi's stomach dropped. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment as nearby passengers turned their heads. Marcus held the letter out further. Ma'am, this is my daughter's life-saving treatment. Everything is documented. Please just read. But Karen cut him off with a cold laugh, the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. I've seen this before. Drugs. Needles. You people always find excuses. The words hit like a slap. Naomi's chest tightened, her eyes widening with both shame and disbelief. Evelyn's lips parted as if to protest, but the words caught in her throat. Marcus's voice remained calm, but steel threaded through it now. With respect, Ms. Whitaker, I am a licensed pediatric immunologist. My daughter suffers from a rare autoimmune disorder. This medication keeps her alive. Here, he opened his wallet and presented his medical ID. Please, I am asking you to be reasonable. But Karen's gaze was fixed, unblinking, her breathing shallow. To her, the pouch wasn't a medical necessity, it was a threat. A trigger. Her mind flickered back to her own past. The nights she had found her son pale and sweating, syringes scattered across his bedroom floor. She had sworn never again, never on her watch. And though the uniform demanded professionalism, the old wound spoke louder. Sir, she said, her tone low and resolute, I'm not letting this stay on my plane. Gasps rippled through the nearby rows. Naomi's throat closed up. Dad, she whispered, her voice breaking. Marcus tightened his grip on the pouch, refusing to let go. This is a mistake you do not want to make. For a heartbeat, the aisle was a battlefield of silence. One man holding the lifeline of his daughter, one woman convinced she was preventing catastrophe. Passengers leaned in, tension prickling the air like static before a storm. And then, in a sudden, shocking motion, Karen lunged. That single act, the reach of her hand toward the pouch, would ignite a chain of events that no one on Flight 732 would ever forget. The Carter's fragile peace was over. The storm had arrived. The moment Karen's hand darted forward, time seemed to fracture. Marcus instinctively pulled the insulated pouch closer to his chest, his doctor's composure wavering for the first time. Stop, he said firmly, his voice low but edged with urgency. You don't know what you're doing. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. She clutched at her mother's sleeve, eyes wide, voice trembling. Mom, please don't let her. But Karen's determination was fueled not by reason, but by something rawer, fear dressed up as authority. She gripped the pouch with both hands, yanking it from Marcus's grasp before he could fully react. No! Naomi screamed, her voice so sharp it cut through the steady drone of the engines. Heads turned. Conversations halted. A baby began to cry. Marcus rose halfway from his seat, his hands still outstretched. That is my daughter's medication. If you throw it away, you are endangering her life. But Karen's mind was already closed, her actions propelled by memories of syringes and shattered trust. In one swift, devastating motion, she strode to the service hatch near the galley, flipped the chute open, and shoved the pouch inside. A dull thunk echoed as the hatch slammed shut. Silence engulfed the cabin. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the muted rush of air outside the fuselage. Then Naomi's sob broke the stillness. She collapsed back into her seat, clutching her chest as if the air itself had betrayed her. Her journal slipped from her lap, pages crumpling against the floor. It's gone, she whispered, her voice shattered. It's gone. Evelyn gathered her daughter into her arms, tears welling in her eyes. Baby, breathe. Just breathe. But her own chest was tight, her own breath ragged. Marcus stood frozen, his gaze locked on Karen. His normally calm, academic demeanor was gone, replaced by a simmering fury that made the surrounding passengers shift uneasily. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of restrained rage. You just destroyed $18,000 worth of medicine, he said slowly, each word measured like a hammer striking steel. But more importantly, You may have just signed my daughter's death sentence." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. She tried to stand taller, as if clinging to protocol could shield her. "For the safety of this flight, Safety?" Marcus's voice rose, sharp and commanding. "You think safety is denying a child the very thing keeping her alive? You think safety is ignoring medical credentials and legal documents? You think safety is—" His voice broke, not from weakness, but from the raw edge of desperation. "Taking hope out of her hands?" Naomi's cries filled the air, each sob a reminder of the irreversible loss. Around them, passengers shifted in their seats, murmurs swelling into outrage. A young man pulled out his phone, recording. Others whispered, shaking their heads in disbelief. An elderly woman across the aisle spoke up, her voice quivering but firm. "She told you it was medicine. The father showed you proof. How could you do that?" Karen's jaw clenched. "I did what I thought was right." "Right?" Another passenger barked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You just threw away a kid's lifeline." The murmurs grew louder, sharper. The cabin was no longer neutral ground. It was a courtroom, and Karen stood accused. Evelyn rocked Naomi gently, whispering soothing words that did little to ease the girl's sobs. Marcus, meanwhile, straightened his shoulders, reclaiming the authority that had momentarily slipped. He turned to the nearest intercom panel, his voice steady but urgent. "Captain, this is Dr. Marcus Carter. We have a medical emergency. My daughter has been deprived of her essential treatment. We need to divert this plane immediately." There was a pause, static crackling through the speaker. Then came the pilot's calm but detached reply. "Dr. Carter, please remain seated. We'll assess the situation once." Marcus slammed his palm against the bulkhead, startling those around him. His voice thundered with a mix of fury and fear. "There is no assessment left to make. The medication is gone. My daughter's life is in jeopardy, and every second counts." Naomi lifted her tear-streaked face, her voice barely audible. "Dad, I don't feel so good." That single sentence hit harder than any shout. Evelyn pressed her forehead against Naomi's, whispering, "Stay with me, sweetheart. We're here. We won't let you go." The passengers were no longer passive observers. Phones were raised, voices were raised higher still. What had begun as a single confrontation had now escalated into a collective outcry. And through it all, Karen stood by the galley door, her chest heaving, her eyes betraying a flicker of something beyond anger, guilt, confusion, perhaps even the realization of what she had done. But the damage was done. The pouch was gone. The fragile hope that had carried Naomi into the sky was gone with it. And now, the Carters would have to fight not just for her dreams, but for her very survival. The cabin of Flight 732 was no longer a place of quiet travel. It was a crucible. Every eye was locked on the Carters, every ear tuned to the tremor in Naomi's breathing. The young girl sat hunched forward, her skin pale, her mother's arms wrapped protectively around her. The sobbing had quieted, replaced by the shallow gasps of someone fighting against both panic and physiology. Marcus Carter stood in the aisle, his tall frame casting a shadow over Karen, who lingered stiffly near the galley door. His normally calm, academic tone was gone, replaced by the fire of a father whose patience had finally shattered. "You have destroyed my daughter's treatment," he said, his voice like tempered steel. "And you've done it against documented evidence, against federal guidelines, and against my direct medical authority." Karen crossed her arms, though her hands trembled faintly. "Sir, I was acting for the safety of the cabin. I thought—" Marcus cut her off, his eyes blazing. "You didn't think. You reacted. And now my daughter is at risk of systemic collapse." He raised his voice so the surrounding passengers could hear. "This is no longer a misunderstanding. This is a medical emergency." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the rows. Phones continued recording. The cabin was an audience to a drama that no one could escape. Marcus turned sharply toward the nearest intercom panel. With one decisive motion, he pressed the button and spoke directly into the system. "Captain Riley, this is Dr. Marcus Carter, board-certified pediatric immunologist, license number 421765. My daughter has been deprived of her life-saving medication, by a member of your crew. I am declaring a medical emergency under FAA Regulation 121.557. I am formally requesting that this aircraft divert to the nearest facility immediately." For a long moment, only static answered. Then the captain's voice came through, calm, clipped, distant. "Dr. Carter, please return to your seat. We'll consult with medical professionals on the ground to determine." No, Marcus's voice rose, clear and commanding. "There is no consultation needed. The medication has been destroyed. The condition is autoimmune, systemic, progressive, and time-sensitive. Without intervention, my daughter will deteriorate. If you refuse to divert, you are complicit in her suffering and in her potential death." The words hung heavy in the recycled air. Evelyn's voice trembled as she stroked Naomi's hair. "Marcus, please. Make them understand." He placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder, then turned back to the intercom, his jaw set. "Captain, listen to me not as a father, but as a physician. This is life or death. Divert. Now." The surrounding passengers erupted, some shouting at the attendants, others raising their phones higher, broadcasting live to an audience that grew by the second. One young man shouted, "He's a doctor. What are you waiting for?" An older woman added, "If that were my granddaughter, we'd already be on the ground." Karen's face hardened, but doubt flickered in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but Marcus silenced her with a look that could have cut stone. "This is no longer your decision," he said flatly. "You made your choice. Now the captain will make his." The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice, slightly strained this time. "Dr. Carter, please remain calm. We'll be consulting with dispatch and FAA protocol." "Calm," Marcus thundered, his voice carrying through the cabin. "Calm won't save her. Action will." His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the intercom tighter. "If you wait, you're gambling with her life. And if she loses, every eye in this cabin, every phone recording this moment, every person watching across the world will know it was because you chose protocol over humanity." A hush fell. Even Naomi, weak and trembling, looked up at her father with wide eyes. For Marcus Carter, this was not just about saving his daughter. It was about drawing a line in the sand, the point where rules and prejudice bowed before truth and justice. In the cockpit, Captain Riley weighed his options. In the cabin, the Carters waited for a verdict. And across the digital world, strangers who had tuned into a live stream began to flood the internet with a single, unifying demand. Divert the plane. The tension inside Flight 732 was no longer contained to the narrow aluminum body hurtling through the sky. It had begun to seep into the digital veins of the world. 3 rows behind the Carters sat Jada Simmons, a 24-year-old communications student from Denver, traveling home after visiting family. She had been scrolling through TikTok absent-mindedly when the first raised voices snapped her attention forward. At first, she thought it was just another passenger dispute. But when she heard the words, "You just destroyed my daughter's medication," echo down the aisle, she froze. Her instincts as both a student of media and a member of Gen Z kicked in. She tapped the Go Live button on her phone without hesitation. "Y'all," she whispered into the camera, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "You won't believe what's happening on this plane. A flight attendant just threw away a black girl's life-saving medication." She angled her phone discreetly to capture the sight. Dr. Marcus Carter standing tall, gripping the intercom, his daughter curled in her mother's arms, the flight attendant stiff and defensive by the galley. The image spoke for itself, authority, injustice, and desperation in one frame. At first, only a handful of viewers joined. 10, 20, 100. Comments trickled in. "Wait, what? Are you serious right now? Stay safe, sis, keep recording." Within minutes, Jada's stream began to snowball. A friend shared it on Twitter. Another clipped a 30-second highlight and posted it to Instagram stories. The comments turned into outrage. "This is medical negligence. She should sue the airline into the ground. We need names. We need receipts." Naomi, shivering in her seat, glanced toward Jada's phone. For the first time since the pouch had been taken, she felt something flicker inside her. Not hope exactly, but recognition. Someone was watching. Someone cared. Evelyn whispered to her, "Baby, the world is seeing this. You're not invisible." By the time the viewer count hit 10,000, hashtags had begun to spread. Hashtag justice for Naomi. Hashtag Ascendair emergency. Hashtag let her live. In the aisle, Marcus continued to argue firmly with the cockpit through the intercom. His voice was resolute, but the sweat on his brow betrayed the urgency pounding in his chest. Every word he spoke was now amplified beyond the fuselage. When Jada's livestream reached 50,000 viewers, a well-known journalist retweeted the video with a single caption: "A black family is being denied basic medical dignity mid-flight. This is America, 2025. The internet erupted. Comments flooded in from around the world. "I'm watching from London. This is insane. From South Africa, this is heartbreaking. Stay strong, Naomi. Divert that damn plane." Meanwhile, inside the cabin, the pressure shifted. Passengers who had been silent began to speak. A middle-aged businessman slammed his laptop shut. "Captain needs to land this plane now," he barked. A young mother cuddling her toddler muttered loudly, "If that were my child, I'd tear this plane apart." Even the elderly Asian man who had been dismissed earlier raised his frail voice. "Do not let her die here." Karen's face grew paler with each passing minute. She tried to retreat to the galley, but the eyes of the passengers followed her like a jury. Some filmed openly, others whispered heatedly. The authority she had once wielded like a weapon was dissolving under the glare of public scrutiny. And all the while, the numbers on Jada's screen climbed. 75,000, 90,000, 100,000. The weight of 100,000 witnesses pressed against the cockpit door. The captain's voice finally broke through again on the intercom, this time strained, no longer detached. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are diverting to Denver International for an unscheduled emergency landing. Please remain calm and seated as we begin preparations." The cabin exploded, not with panic, but with a release of tension so sharp it almost felt like a cheer. Applause, shouts of relief, tears of gratitude. Evelyn kissed Naomi's forehead, whispering, "We're landing, sweetheart. Hold on. Just hold on." Marcus exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. His hands still shook, but there was triumph beneath the exhaustion. He met Karen's eyes across the aisle, and for the first time, she looked away. Jada panned her camera back to herself, tears streaking her cheeks. "They're landing," she told the 100,000 viewers watching. "Because you saw. Because you cared. Don't stop talking about this. Naomi deserves better. We all deserve better." And just like that, what began as a quiet injustice in a cramped airplane cabin had become a national reckoning in real time. Justice was no longer confined to the Carter's fight. Justice had gone viral. When Flight 732 finally touched down at Denver International Airport, the cabin erupted with a rush of emotions. Relief, frustration, anger, exhaustion. The screech of the landing gear against the runway was almost drowned out by the mixture of applause from some passengers and groans from others. For Naomi, the landing came not a moment too soon. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale, her body trembling against her mother's embrace. Evelyn whispered prayers under her breath, rocking her daughter gently, clinging to the fragile comfort that at least they were now closer to help. Marcus stood tall even as fatigue pulled at his shoulders. He had forced this landing through sheer willpower, through the strength of a father's rage and a doctor's authority. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Landing was only step one. Accountability was next. The intercom chimed. Captain Riley's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an unscheduled diversion, this crew's duty hours have now expired under FAA regulation. We apologize for the inconvenience, but federal law prohibits us from continuing service until replacement staff arrive." The words landed like a brick. A wave of groans surged through the plane. Passengers who had been patient turned restless. A middle-aged man in a business suit shot to his feet, red-faced and furious. "You've got to be kidding me. I'm missing my daughter's wedding for this circus." He glared toward the Carter's row, his voice rising. "All because of you people and your drama." Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief, but before she could respond, another voice cut across the aisle. A woman in her 30s, holding a crying toddler, snapped back. Drama? That girl almost died up here. She might still die if we don't move fast enough. Which is more important, your tuxedo or her life? The businessman faltered, his mouth opening and closing without reply. The division inside the cabin became unmistakable. Some passengers muttered angrily about missed connections and ruined plans. Others spoke fiercely in defense of the Carters, their voices rising in outrage at the injustice they had witnessed. Jada, still live streaming, captured every word. Her phone shook slightly as she panned across the cabin. "Y'all see this?" she whispered into the mic. "Half the plane's mad about being late. The other half's mad about injustice. This is America in a nutshell." Naomi stirred weakly against her mother, her voice barely audible. "Mom, are they mad at me?" Evelyn kissed her temple, fighting back tears. "No, baby. They're mad at the truth. That's not your burden to carry." Marcus raised a hand, commanding the cabin's attention without shouting. "Every one of you has the right to be frustrated," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But understand this. If this were your child, your son, your daughter, you wouldn't be thinking about connections or weddings. You'd be thinking about survival. That is what this is about. Not convenience. Not delay. Survival." A hush fell over the rows. Even those who had been muttering fell silent. For a moment, empathy cracked through the frustration. As the plane taxied to its gate, emergency medical personnel boarded quickly, their blue uniforms and bright red equipment bags cutting through the tension. They rushed to Naomi, checking her vitals, preparing to transfer her to the nearest hospital. Evelyn stepped aside reluctantly, her hand never leaving her daughter's until the paramedics assured her they had her stabilized. Through it all, Karen sat rigid in her jump seat, her hands gripping the edges until her knuckles turned white. Her authority, once absolute, now looked fragile, even pitiful. She glanced nervously at the dozens of phones still pointed in her direction, the whispers, the stares. She opened her mouth as if to explain herself, but the weight of the moment pinned her silence. When the Carters finally disembarked, flanked by paramedics and followed by the eyes of every passenger, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted once more. Some passengers applauded quietly, others lowered their heads in shame, and still others muttered bitterly about delays. But the truth was undeniable. Flight 732 was grounded, not just by FAA law, but by the moral reckoning of what had just unfolded in the skies. Outside, reporters were already gathering. Jada's live stream had gone far beyond a viral clip. It had become a national headline before the wheels even touched the runway. Vans with satellite dishes crowded near the terminal, journalists pressed against barriers, microphones ready. For the Carters, the night would not bring rest. For Karen, the night would not bring escape. And for Ascendair, the night would not bring silence. The reckoning had only just begun. The Denver terminal was a storm of flashing cameras, urgent voices, and confusion. As Naomi was wheeled out on a stretcher toward the waiting ambulance, reporters shouted questions over each other, microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Dr. Carter, will you sue the airline?" "Naomi, how are you feeling?" "Mrs. Carter, what message do you have for America tonight?" Evelyn shielded her daughter from the chaos, whispering reassurances while paramedics secured the gurney. Marcus, however, did not flinch. He raised a hand, silencing the clamor for a brief, powerful moment. His expression was one of controlled fury, his voice steady but charged with conviction. "My daughter almost lost her life tonight," he said, his words echoing through the terminal and across countless live streams. "Not because of a medical condition, but because of negligence, prejudice, and a system that failed to protect her. This is not just about one child. This is about every passenger who carries medicine, every parent who travels with a sick child, every family who expects dignity when they fly. Ascendair will answer for this." The crowd erupted in questions again, but Marcus turned away, his focus solely on Naomi as she was loaded into the ambulance. Hours later, inside a sterile conference room at the Denver airport, the battle lines were drawn. Across the table sat two Ascendair executives, flanked by corporate attorneys with thick binders and guarded expressions. At the far end, Karen Whitaker sat hunched, her uniform wrinkled, her face pale and streaked from tears. Opposite them, Marcus sat tall, Evelyn beside him, her hands clasped tightly. Next to them was Paul Wexler, a fellow passenger and civil rights attorney, who had stepped forward to represent the Carters after witnessing everything firsthand. His presence radiated quiet authority. The lead executive cleared his throat. "Dr. Carter, on behalf of Ascendair, we deeply regret what transpired aboard Flight 732. We want to assure you this does not reflect our company's values." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Regret doesn't return my daughter's medication. Regret doesn't erase the terror she felt. Regret doesn't undo the fact that a member of your staff destroyed a child's lifeline." Karen shifted uncomfortably, tears spilling anew. I thought. Naomi, sitting beside her mother now with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, raised her head and spoke for the first time since the ordeal. Her voice was quiet but cut like glass. "My life is not your excuse." The room went still. Karen's sob broke the silence, but Marcus did not soften. He turned back to the executives. "Here are my terms," he said firmly. 1. Full coverage of Naomi's ongoing medical care, including replacement of all destroyed medication. 2. Accommodations and compensation for every passenger affected by the diversion. 3. A binding commitment to change, system-wide training for all staff on medical handling, emergency protocol, and implicit bias. This is not optional. It is non-negotiable. The attorneys exchanged uneasy glances. One began to protest, but Paul Wexler raised a hand, his calm voice carrying weight. "I'd think very carefully before refusing. You're already trending on every social platform. Half the country is demanding accountability. If you resist, this won't just be a lawsuit. It will be the end of Ascendair's public credibility." The executives shifted, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Finally, one nodded slowly. "We will comply. Immediate medical coverage and accommodations will be provided. And we will begin drafting what we will call—" He hesitated, then looked toward Naomi. "The Naomi Carter Protocol." Evelyn gasped softly, her hand tightening around her daughter's. Naomi blinked, her eyes wide, not fully grasping the weight of what had just been promised. Karen, however, broke down completely. "I never meant to hurt her," she whispered. "My son, he overdosed. Syringes, needles. I saw that pouch, and all I could think was—" Marcus's voice was firm, unyielding. "Your trauma is not my daughter's burden." The words landed like a gavel. Karen's shoulders collapsed. She would be dismissed from Ascendair within the week, her name forever tied to this night, not as a protector, but as a cautionary tale. The weeks that followed turned Flight 732 into more than an incident. It became a movement. News outlets ran Naomi's story daily. Lawmakers cited the Carters in hearings on airline safety and racial bias. Social media continued to echo the phrase, "My life is not your excuse." And when Ascendair officially launched the Naomi Carter Protocol, requiring all flight staff nationwide to undergo mandatory training in medical handling, de-escalation, and racial equity, the Carters knew their pain had been transformed into purpose. But for Marcus, for Evelyn, and especially for Naomi, the journey was far from over. The scars remained. The memory of that pouch, tossed away like trash, lingered. Yet so did the fire, the resolve to ensure no other family would ever endure what they had. The showdown was over. The fallout had begun. The story of Flight 732 did not end on the tarmac in Denver. In many ways, that was only the beginning. For Naomi Carter, recovery was slow but steady. The days in the hospital blurred together at first, blood tests for drips, nurses moving in and out with soft voices and steady hands. Yet through the haze, she felt something new surrounding her, a wave of support so large it seemed to lift her out of despair. Letters poured in from strangers across the country. Hashtags carrying her name continued to trend for weeks. Children with chronic illnesses sent her drawings of clouds and planes, calling her our hero in the sky. When she was finally strong enough to walk into Stanford's campus months later, her steps were careful, but her spirit was unshaken. She didn't just arrive for an interview. She arrived as a symbol of resilience. The admissions committee saw more than grades and essays. They saw a young woman who had faced death at 35,000 feet and turned her survival into a beacon. Naomi was awarded a full scholarship that very week. Her parents stood by, proud but humbled. Evelyn often said the hardest part of that flight wasn't the confrontation. It was holding her daughter while the world debated whether her life was worth delaying theirs. Marcus, once simply a respected doctor, had become something more, an advocate, a national voice for medical equity in air travel. He testified before Congress, urging reforms that extended far beyond Ascendair. And the reforms came. The Naomi Carter Protocol became a federal standard, mandating training for all U.S. airlines on handling medical equipment, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. Airlines began issuing specialized tags and priority clearance for passengers carrying critical medication. A hotline was established for travelers with chronic conditions, ensuring that emergencies would never again be dismissed as inconvenience. But the Carters wanted to do more than change policy. They wanted to change lives. With settlement funds and community donations, they founded the Naomi's Path Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families of children with rare diseases, providing both financial aid and advocacy resources for safe travel. Within a year, the foundation had partnered with hospitals across the country, creating emergency kits for patients who traveled. As for Karen Whitaker, her name faded from the headlines, but not from memory. She lost her job, disgraced in the eyes of the public. Some pitied her, citing her trauma. Others condemned her, seeing her as the face of prejudice hidden behind authority. For the Carters, she became neither villain nor victim. She was simply the cautionary reminder that fear and bias could cost lives if left unchecked. Months later, Naomi returned to the skies, not as a passenger, but as a guest speaker for the launch of the Naomi Carter Protocol. Standing at the podium in a crisp blazer, her voice carried through the crowded terminal. "I was once a girl who thought flying was freedom," she began. "But on Flight 732, I learned that freedom is fragile when dignity isn't guaranteed. No one should ever have to beg for their life to be respected. My hope is that this protocol ensures no other child feels what I felt, that their worth is negotiable." The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Tears filled the eyes of strangers who saw not just a teenager, but a survivor, a leader, a catalyst. Later that evening, Naomi sat by her window, looking out at the streaks of planes cutting across the twilight sky. She opened her journal, the same one that had fallen to the floor of Flight 732. She turned to a blank page and wrote, "This time, the clouds don't look like fields I'll never reach. This time, they look like paths waiting for me to walk." The tragedy of that flight had carved scars. But it also built bridges, between strangers, between communities, between the present and a better future. And so the story of Naomi Carter did not end in fear, or in anger, or even in survival. It ended in legacy. A legacy that soared far beyond the skies. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to help us spread Naomi's legacy, and subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful story we bring to light. We want to hear from you. What would you have done if you were on Flight 732? Have you ever faced injustice while traveling, at work, or in daily life? Share your story in the comments below, because these conversations matter more than you think. And if you're looking for what's next, tomorrow's video will uncover another jaw-dropping story, where one family's nightmare forced an entire system to change. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until then, remember Naomi's words. My life is not your excuse. Carry them with you, because they might just change the way you see the world.